anyway, I'll just say it's like a lot of people who are my friends, and I'm so happy to see all the names in the Zoom virtual participant list. And I'm kind of nervous. Somehow a Zoom event is like weirdly nervous. So I was going to just read something very, like read my little thank you list and then read a little bit from the book. And then Eugene and I were gonna talk about things. I was thinking about this book, which I feel like I told so many people about, and it sounded like a joke, a sort of like extended, absurd joke that I think a lot of people were like, you're not really seriously writing about that. And yet I was. And I feel very self-conscious and sort of like embarrassed, but I think I actually like lean into that kind of embarrassment as a project. And I was thinking that this book, it kind of came out of the election, but it also kind of came out of Hurricane Sandy, and it came out of my own childhood, because I think thinking about talking animals was a way to express love when I felt just more and more kind of rage and despair. So writing this was very much a survival technique that I developed. And it's just really interesting to write a book because you sort of turn your own survival technique or coping mechanism into a shareable coping mechanism, hopefully. And it becomes something that's really personal, becomes something shared and kind of hopefully useful to other people. But in that process, you need so many people to actually help you do that. So I just really, there's too many people, and like a lot of them are in the room right now with me. It's too many people to thank by name, but I just really wanted to specifically say thank you to FSG Originals and Jeremy Davies, my editor, who is so amazing, so amazing. Allison Devereaux, my agent, also so amazing. Alexis and Deborah Geim and Alexis Nowicki at FSG, who are both like so enthusiastic and so present in all the sort of like endless details of this. I wanted to thank Book Hug Press in Canada for publishing my first book and publishing the Canadian edition of this one. I want to thank Eugene, who has been so supportive and helpful the entire kind of process, and McNally Jackson for hosting. And then last, I just want to be kind of cheesy and thank Rob Callahan, my husband, who was the first person who kind of talked to me about all of this and then has kind of been my conceptual collaborator in sort of imagining New York as an animal world. So all these people, it means so much to me. It really does. It means like, it means so much. And I didn't sort of anticipate launching the book in this reality, the way things are right now. But I really think that it was an attempt to both celebrate and like bring love to New York City in a really, and yeah, I like urban life in a really difficult time that's gotten way more difficult. And then also to sort of like celebrate all my friends who I think have known and like continually really inspire me with the sort of like need to change. And I think this book is about like the need to change without knowing what that means exactly. So yeah, that's my little speech. And then I was just gonna read the beginning of my book. And I wanna read my two uh, epigraphs, because they just putting them together was I was extremely proud of it. It was a very complicated process to get the Brecht quote. So I need to read it because it really took a lot to get it. This is Bertolt Brecht, one of the Svenborg poems. It's a little piece. In the dark times, will there be singing? There will be singing of the dark times. And then number 2. People come up to me and ask, why are the llamas humming? He said, and I'll say, because they don't know the words. And that was from a New York Times article from 2013. The city is an island, and an island is a ship that never sails. The city is a vessel for animals. A long time ago, before the island was a city, it was a crumb of land bobbing in an ocean tea. But even then, it was jammed with plants and animals. The island has always teemed with life, moored as it is at a powerful juncture of rivers, the ocean, greater islands, and a whole roiling continent. It is hard now to picture the island of before in its green state crisscrossed by streams and edged by marshes, as it has been changed so thoroughly by wave after wave of arrival and violence, construction and reconstruction. But before or after, this place was ever vital. This was never just any old island. It was always a planet in miniature, a bubble of disordered life. When the outsiders came, they came in messy herds. Foreign birds arrived in flocks, and multitudes climbed from rough wooden crafts, all knees and heaves over the silty rocks. Once grounded, some lay for a long time, crying for beloved friends lost at sea. Others put their grief aside and got straight to business. Whatever the attitude, all newcomers carried some memory, potent or cloudy, of the homes they'd left behind. They hoisted various flags and commenced the same battles that had driven them from their old lands in the first place. More than more arrived. You've never seen such a multitude. Everyone squeezed in and then did it again. So tight did it become that the ground in some areas disappeared beneath the crush of living creatures. The island swayed and creaked, but did not sink, because this was a ship of bedrock. Native gulls turned above flocks of European starlings, strategizing in trees. The creatures from away brought with them panic. Gruesome histories trailed like a putrid smell. They had firm notions of how life should be lived, and they intended to impose them. The island trembled. Somebody cobbled a street where a soft path had been. Somebody drew a map. Somebody carried out a massacre. Animals tore into one another. They spread diseases and infections. A pool of blood formed, dried up, then turned into flakes that the wind carried away. There is no story of a city that is not also a story of brutality. There is no story of brutality that has not been retold as one of heroism. The invasive species began right away to mythologize themselves. They renamed everything. They got into fights with one another, and whoever won renamed places once again. They built houses, stores, bars, and jails out of the island's trees. The city burned again and again, and they rebuilt it in whatever architectural fashion was current. Everything was brutal and everyone died. The living tore down old buildings and erected new ones in their place. They renamed streets and buildings after their dead, only for the living to die and turn. To repress the psychic chaos that swirled inside, the living turned to numerology. They began to count everything and categorize what they counted. Someone measured out the whole island, then divided it with a grid. Grid sent the message that everything was under control. Meanwhile, more arrived and more died. Don't panic, they murmured to one another as they drew out long, straight lines. Once they had the grid on their map, they set about filling every square on the real-life land. They built great halls and courthouses. They built fire stations and granaries. Around the edges, they erected docks and strung bridges. Larger and larger ships kept bringing in more beings and things. Some grumbled because by now they saw themselves not as invasive, but rather as new kinds of native species. The community worked on complicated myths to explain away the violence at the core of their city making. Streets and avenues continued to creep until they covered not just the first island, but surrounding islands as well. See, here a beam, there a reservoir, here a scaffold, there a retaining wall, here a beer hall, there a bakery, here a sweatshop, there an armory, here a train station with vaulted ceilings painted celestial blue, and there a system of grease-black tunnels. The living paved over old cobbling. They numbered and lettered the new trains. After very vigorous debate, Helvetica was chosen as the official typeface for all signs. Buildings grew tall. Apartments stretched along streets like rows of stalls in a stable. Rooms proliferated inside like cells in a hive. As the cityscape expanded, it also shrank. It came to feel as if the whole population lived together in one big house. Bricks, wallpaper, matted fur, insulation, granite, saliva, glue, Venetian blinds, mud, twigs, vinyl siding, steel beams. They overlapped and merged. Architecture and infrastructure blurred into continuous surface. This great combine creased and flipped so that private was public and public concealed itself in plain sight. Looking out might as well be looking in, as building walls made streets into halls. Foyers led to front doors, led to bedrooms with views of, if one was lucky, the Hudson River or the Kosciuszko Bridge. In summer, sun pounded the sidewalks and the heat intensified the hot smell of everything. Citizens put plants into pots and put those pots on their sills. Youths leapt into turquoise pools that sat in the middle of emerald parks. Air conditioners hummed dangerously overhead. The city was like a pizza oven, and the inhabitants were greasy little toppings. These toppings felt weak or furious. Vendors sold chili mango and ices. Smoke and steam billowed up to join the clouds. The clouds grew tense. Rain fell heavy. The storm cleared up. Everyone felt happy, but then the heat would return, bringing with it fury and fatigue. In late summer, places closed for vacation. Those who could fled. Then September would come, school would start, and everything would be open and packed once again. Fall was the most beautiful. Then came winter. The first snow was nice, but every subsequent just coated the frozen street filth. The melange melted and refroze, and the city would be miserable for months. Winter lasted half a year or more before the winds blew in spring, when every tree exploded with pollen and flowers. Ginkgo and linden released their funky cream perfumes. The island went mad with joy and allergies. The streets stank. Storefronts emitted puffs of salon chemicals and cooking grease, dung and bleach, fungus and air freshener. When crowds on the trains pressed together, they released whiffs of cocoa butter and Chanel. Trash piled up. Workers took it away. There was so much stuff that even nice things cycled into the trash. Whoever got tired of their shoes just left them on a stoop. Someone else would put them on. Creatures threw out whole bedroom sets and decent abstract paintings. Socks, umbrellas, books, and incense could be bought on any street corner. The crush, the wealth, the waste of wealth, All the tight quarters and inward-facing rooms made residents obsess over their bodies, their fur and feathers. They ignored seasonal dress and followed instead the Gulf Streams of fashion, tatters in winter and suits for summer, horn rims and portafortunas, buffalo plaids and leopard prints, socks and sandals. It all came and went, then returned later, reimagined. Everything was beautiful artifice. Creatures obsessed over the unwritten laws of class, order, family, genus, and species. Mayors and council members chatted amongst themselves and with bankers. It had to do with ideology. It had to do with money. The island, which was by now a city absolute, was full. One could get whatever one wanted, but walking around the block cost more than whatever you had in your pocket. A few had way too much, some had enough, and many had nothing. Many moved away because they were tired, but plenty stayed because they didn't have enough to leave. Things got violent once again. Though each age seemed as if it would go on indefinitely, the wheel of fortune turned. Outside wanted in afresh, up wanted down. Those who'd fled to live in smaller herds drifted back to join the urban masses. The bubble shifted and shimmered. The city was a mystical chimera that spoke in the voices of multiple animals. It was a teacher, and its core lesson was that all must find peace with their own restless suffering. It also taught restlessness. The city didn't care who was jubilant and who was suicidal. It witnessed without comment. As a great teacher, the city had its true devotees, and they would twist themselves into knots to make sense of their master's riddles. They turned the incomprehensible into a logo, a slogan, a beast, a balloon in the parade. Pressure from within countered that from without in exquisite tension. The city was an impossibility, an impossible yet existing place. It was a real piece of work. Animals from everywhere loved its whole routine. They adored the city enough to wear its name silk-screened on t-shirts. These t-shirts hailed others with a greeting that doubled as a warning. "Welcome to New York," it read. "Now duck, motherfucker."
That was terrific. Thank you, Joni. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This is an amazing, quietly subversive novel that if you can order, and Maris has put the link in the chat, so please do. This is a quietly subversive novel where talking animals live and fight and protest and die and lose and win in New York City. It touches on our role in a climate-destroying economic system. So I thought it would be best to start with the most profound questions. So first most profound question is, why llamas?
So yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit in preparation, and it's amazing to me that it all, like, everything came out of Mitchell-Lama housing, which New Yorkers I had never heard of, and Rob said it very randomly, like, so and so lives in Mitchell-Lama housing, and when you don't, like, when I was studying French and someone said like hot dog in French, I suddenly heard hot dog, and it not as like, and I could only think of a dog who was hot. And there was something about like Mitchell Llama housing where I was like, it's a llama named Mitchell. And so I started thinking about a kind of miniature city where you like go to apply for middle income housing, and there's just like a door and there's a llama behind the door, and that's who runs it. And it started, like spinning out the joke of, the other animals that would run like the DOE and different like departments and like who could be where. And I think as like not a native New Yorker, there's so many different like layers, that somehow like assigning it to an animal became really like pleasurable and manageable. And then the main character, so I was like, we talked about Mitchellama first, and then it was like his sadder friend, Alpaca was the original name, but like Alfonso, the main character. And I really liked when I did actually like delve into llamas and alpacas. Alpacas are kind of like llamas are somehow more famous, and alpacas are like the friend. And I really liked the sort of like combination of the llama and the alpaca, and they're just intensely like charming animals. So even though Mitchellama housing comes from like two men who were, one was a city councilor and one was like a state government, neither of them have anything to do with like real llamas, but I was like, anyway.
The Mitchell llama is such a New York reference. It's something that you kind of, there's no reason to know outside of New York or urban studies maybe, but this leads to the question about the other great character in the book, other than Alfonso the alpaca and Mitchell llama. There's one of the other great characters in the book, and we just heard you read it so beautifully, is the character of New York City. And now we're all stuck at home for the most part. We miss and even sometimes forget what we love about the city, if you're tuning in from New York City. The casual urban life, the walk, the crowds, the subways, the overheard arguments, the characters. I think we were joking, or not even joking, we're talking about the other day of watching movies just so you could see New York City like in the 70s or in the subway or whatever. So I loved revisiting the city and reading about the city and seeing the city reflected in the book. So the question to you is, why is New York City so present in the book? What is New York City to you, and what is New York City to this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the sort of Mitchellama as the key, then it's like, because Mitchellama was this animal, and then I was like, well, he has to have a job in the city. And it, like, before I ever lived in New York, I think my whole trajectory outside of living in New Mexico, which was definitely, it's an urban area that's very vast. It's not a city. But I like moved to cities and sort of like fell in love with city experience, and Montreal, and then Vancouver and New York and Chicago, and studied a lot about kind of urban theory. And, you know, I took so many classes where it's like the city is the site of art and resistance and the sort of what society is, or like life. Community is like comes from the formation of cities in certain ways. And then, you know, I made a soundtrack or a playlist that will be out at some point with Large-Hearted Boy. And I was like putting together music about the city and the book. And it's like, I was remembering being embarrassed. It's like loving New York felt like embarrassing, because it's like everybody loves New York, or it's so widely loved, it's so widely depicted, that I think, again, it felt sort of like you shouldn't write a book about New York and you shouldn't write a book about animals talking, because those two things are kind of like super weighed down and freighted, and people kind of well, at least they hate. I think there's a whole kind of mockery of New York books and New York publishing, and New York is so heavy. So because it was like, probably that's a bad idea, then I ended up as like, what if I combine questionable ideas? Because I do really, I was thinking about like when I used to live in Montreal, and the first time I came to New York, and I was like, oh, I love it. You know, like you do have a relationship with cities, and it does really feel like it's been a major relationship in my life, the non-human relationship you have with the place you live. and it goes through these ups and downs, and it's so easy to criticize. And then, yeah, I think it's all kind of come back so intensely. The fact that it's sort of inaccessible, like I miss New York City while being here, which I think people feel. Because it gives you so much sort of that kind of like flanner, loose access to a place and loose access to other people. And it really, like I put in the part that I read, it really feels like we're in a big house. Like I always have this very intense feeling of New York being one big thing that we all live in, even though obviously like the interiors are so different, and like there's so much inequality and intense difference. It's still like we're all kind of contained within New York. And like the first times that I ever came here from Montreal, I was on like an overnight bus, and you could like at 4 a.m, because it would leave at a very weird time, and then it would wake everyone up by playing Frank Sinatra, like New York, New York, and it would just be like you're entering this place, and it extends really far, but you have like entered the force field of the city. So I wanted to honor all those feelings.
It's a self-mythologizing place, and it's also, like you said, it's a tough thing to break through the cliches of it, but you did it so beautifully, especially in that part that you read. I think it just captures so much of the city. Um, and it is interesting, this idea of taking ideas that traditionally are tough to transcend or write through, like the idea of New York or the idea of talking animals. So, which is verboten for a lot of writers and editors. But let's talk about this conceptual premise. We talked about this a little bit before coming on screen, but what is your relationship to animals? What is you see our culture's relationship to animals? And you had mentioned that you did a thesis on Benjamin, Walter Benjamin, and he had some idea about animals, or he had a particular idea that led you to an idea about animals that stayed with you.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start about talking animals that way.
So, I mean, all of this is something, yeah, it's like, you know, when you write a book and you start thinking about things, and then you're like, oh, I'm really going to think about this for an excessive amount of time. And where I grew up, there was a lot of animal life, because I was outside the city, in the desert on a dirt road, and we had cats, and I loved those cats so much, and they would like kill animals and also be killed by coyotes. And there was a lot of like animals being reality, like being in touch with the real, and that, but also intensely like related to me and intimate kind of, you know, I think everyone who has a pet, there's that sort of like intimate partnership again, like you have your relationship with your city and you also have your relationship with animals, and both these relationships are different than the ones you have with humans. So I always had, and I think also I was going over all the sort of literature that as a child, like the first time, like my first encounters with literature were like Frog and Toad are friends, which we now know they were more than friends. Frog and Toad are more than friends. But there was so many, you know, talking animals is like the foundation of children's literature and fantasy life. And I spent a lot of time like really devoted to that fantasy life, like drawing animals and writing stories. And then you sort of get to this other point where it becomes forbidden as an adult theme. And then when I studied Walter Benjamin, and I specifically was interested in like fairy tales, because he wrote all these pieces for children for the radio, like they were directed at children, but he would sort of smuggle in or incorporate kind of philosophical ideas into these like tales, and the idea of like a folk tale or a fairy story that would involve something fantastical. And you know, like E.T.A. Housman doesn't really write about talking animals, but there is this sort of the mystical, the non-human beings, and having like an active relationship with the non-human. So he, and I think when I was also reading about him and this idea of childhood fantasy, but then also children being the idea of the child being the parent of the adult, like your childhood makes you the kind of adult you are. So there's like the reversal in childhood. And I think another thing that he was very like in touch with in a complicated way was the relationship between like women, children, animals as the not adult, like rational man, and them kind of circulating between each other. So women and animals and children and animals like kind of circulate as an alternative space to adult male, you know, very limited kind of point of view. So I felt like writing about animals was a way also to talk about they're treated so badly and yet also held as a special, you know, being that it there, you know, maybe I think when you also, when I, the experience of writing about animals, it's like it is so impossibly deep and there's no end to it. And maybe that's why it gets shunned, because it connects to like dreams and childhood and a lot of stuff that I feel is pretty rejected, at least has been in the tradition of like 20th century serious literature.
I was going to ask this later, but I think now is a good time to bring it up. Your last novel, Double Teenage, a fantastic novel, kind of had this dealt with society's confining constraints on the identity of adolescent girls. Is one of its major themes anyway. This one is quite different, and we discussed a little bit about the move from that arguably darker material to this material, and yet you said just a few minutes ago that Hurricane Sandy was one of the things you were thinking of when you were writing this novel. And I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that movement, the mirage, or maybe the veil of lightness around talking animals, and maybe speak a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, so like in my mind, even though these two books, I wrote a kind of heavy book that deals with some of it, if you haven't read it, or for those of you who haven't read it, it dealt with like the murder of women in Juarez and in Canada, specifically in Vancouver, but it's really widespread. Indigenous women, especially in both cases. But it's like I was trying to sort of sort out, you know, also a probably Benjaminian things that I picked up in that training of like when a human becomes a commodity or also a tool, like you're the end result and you're also just like a cog in the wheel of producing that thing. And I think women are, you know, the role of women as a category is intimately tied up with commodities and also production of. And then animals. So even though that all is like this heavy, intensely heavy material, I feel like there was the same heavy base because, you know, animal kind of the use of animals and the abuse of animals is so kind of the foundation of modern society, that it was the same, if not worse, to really delve into how animals are treated and thought of. But at the same time, I felt like, we said this right before, where it's like when you talk about capitalism and climate change, and capitalism and genocidal projects, even though these are intensely true things, it's hard to talk about them without people kind of like fading out, because we know, and we kind of can't, it's hard to talk about it without it not becoming kind of dulled and flattened. And I think I need,
or overwhelming.
or overwhelming, because it's so true and so painful. And I think, in referencing it's really before the election, but the whole, what we've been living through for the last 5 to 10 years, and longer, the whole project. But I feel like in the past 5 years, at least, I was like, I can't actually live like this. I can't, the rage and the like hatred and the anger that I feel is so intense, that if I don't find a outlet that kind of reconnects me to joy and love, a loving feeling for others. And I felt like by thinking of everyone like an animal, I could bring back some of the joy and lightness to myself. And I also felt like there's something like, I wanted to write a book that felt like refreshing, that it created a little space to think these things without it just being like a litany of genocidal, ruin.
Yeah. We've talked very abstractly about the book, but maybe it will help to give a little bit about the story of the novel, which takes place in New York, revolves around Alfonso the alpaca and his work in the archives, or the archives and documents of City Hall.
Department of Records, yeah.
Department of Records. And he slowly, with his friend Mitchell Valama, gets involved in, goes through life as a grad student, and also perhaps gets involved in neo-revolutionary activities or revolutionary activities. So that's kind of the general idea. You wrote in a recent, or you said in a recent interview, I don't know if that the full stop has been.
I think it's going to come out tomorrow.
But you said something like, I think the best theory showed me that you can write compelling stories that focus more on systems or themes than on individuals. In writing classes, you often encounter weird assumptions about choice and individual personality. And something I'm proud of, you wrote, or that you said about my fiction, is that my characters aren't special or exceptional. I want to write non-heroic literature. I like this a lot, and I can relate to it, but writing about systems a little bit more than focusing on the avatar of a single human personality. What is non-heroic literature, or how would you kind of, how do you think about that project?
So, I mean, when I said it, it was like an off-ended thing, but now I think it's come up with Kyle, who's in this chat, who I was talking to for the Full Stop interview. And we sort of came back to the idea of non-heroic literature. And I feel that if you've been in creative writing classes, there's sometimes, or there's an impulse, there's a strong like narrative impulse to focus on exceptional parts of people's lives or exceptional characters. This is the most wonderful or terrible, like just a monster. Or this is like when everything truly falls apart kind of conclusively. And that's obviously a big generalization. There's all kinds of literature, but I really was interested in not going towards that. I talk about this a little bit in the interview, the cult of the individual and how that intersects with modern writing. And unconsciously, it's like one person moving through the world. And I just don't feel myself, involved in the world that way. And I think that we need to retrain ourselves away from the individual, the cult of the individual. And I think that comes together with the idea of the exceptional. Like, this is the most talented person, this is the smartest, this is the, that crushes so many people because most of us are not the best or the worst. So I really wanted to I felt like, the low level bureaucrat, the okay student who really loves it, but is not maybe the guy who's going to win, he's not on a fast track to tenure. So I really, but the sort of beauty and joy of, or value of, like, regular human beings and the sort of messy middle spaces of decision making. And it's like, again, like, harder because it isn't, I think, what we're encouraged to write about, or even unconsciously trained to sort of be like, let's make this special. And I think the non-heroic impulse is to find something that is not about those kind of, like, always heightened.
I think it's an impulse I identify with a lot. I think as the agency of the individual is becoming more corrupted, impossible to find, I think the novelist kind of has to look at systems more. And so I think that makes total sense. Here's a question from Sarah from the audience. Could you talk a little about how you mapped the divisions between animals onto New York, between predators and prey, between land and sea animals?
Right. That's something I was thinking about this a lot, and I almost think that if I were to make an argument about New York, I think it would be a highly not necessarily vegetarian, but it would lean vegetarian animal, because they are more often like herd animals and could deal with the crowds, and like something like a raccoon, which is not totally it's a carnivore, but it's a pretty loose carnivore. And I feel like big predators would actually be less likely. There might be like wealthy big predators, but I feel like they would have like Montana estates where they would just like go and kill other animals, like, and they would have very, red state rules, like, oh, it's not a crime in this state to like murder others. That was my, unofficial. I think New York would, like, the way you have to live in New York, a lot of the animals, even the animals like cats and dogs, they would kind of like eat fish and be like, I'm a flexitarian. So I tried to map that, because obviously there's always the question of like murder with other animals or consumption of one another. So my sort of slippage, that I think if you read the novel, everything gets displaced onto the sea. And I think of the sea animals have become like the source of food without guilt, and the source of just like throwing all their trash, and just all the sort of aggression of the land has been placed into the sea because it's kind of invisible or unknown. And this goes into a bigger thing. I mean, I studied literature, and there was lots of like the modernist sort of the sea as feminine, the sea as the unknown and the unconscious, and this sort of, the primeval spaces of the sea. So then it's like, that's where they throw all their garbage, which I still think we kind of do. So the revolutionary impulse also comes from the sea, and the animals are kind of trying to deal with a sea revolution, which they cannot fully access, but are, because they're land animals, but they're really trying to get back in touch with a sea revolution.
So I think there are all kinds of, just like any book, speculative fiction or fantastic fiction, you do actually a lot of world building, a lot of decisions, but they're all hidden kind of. And those are, I like the ideas of working with predators and prey, and the idea of murder, or even the ideas of how to go into the subway, and different animals going to the subway. And it's interesting how you think intricately about all those things, and only use some of them in the novel. But it's clear that they were necessary to build the world. But going back to what you were talking about, the sea, in the book, the sea and its creatures are presented in a very particular symbolic position. There's a revolutionary group called SERF, S-E-R-F. What did that stand for again?
And the Sea Equality Revolutionary Front.
Right. So, and I had thought initially that there was kind of this analogy where we are to the animals as the animals are to the surf, or the sea creatures. In other words, the natural world is given a kind of a human consciousness through these anthropomorphized land animals, and they are dealing with the natural world in terms of the animal world, and that world was the sea. But when we had discussed this, you had a kind of different idea, or kind of an expanded notion of what the sea represents in the book. Without giving away any spoilers, could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I question, because it's like the sea is not totally present. It's always this, questioning or presence that they can't quite put their finger on. And one of the reasons that I don't know if this answers the question direct or precisely, but I thought of like land animals and language and written language, or built society, and how that would kind of be less possible in the sea. And the sea is this sort of moving space. So the animals are kind of, I think the land animals choose to be like, they don't have language because it's not on our frequency. But I thought of the sea more than just the difference between us and animals. I think of it kind of like space, like actual astral, aliens, and then also
that which is beyond,
the total beyond, the place. And I think that we on land, human beings on land, do project into, there's a sea sky relationship where, this idea of like light never reaches there, the deepest parts of the ocean kind of just being truly alien, even though it's accessible to us, and it being as alien as what we perceive or hope or fear is in space. So I really think it was like the animal, they had cut off their relationship to land or sea animals, and they had really like cut off their relationship to the unknown and the mystery, and like used it as just like a garbage dump. So I don't know if they ever, how do you make that? I think the question is like, how do we make the leap into that kind of unknown space, or like respect the unknown as it needs to be respected?
That makes sense. I mean, it's almost like remystifying the natural world in a way, or showing how mysterious it really is, and how striking, awesome it really is. Here's another question from the audience. Corey writes, so this kind of question, species can become analogous to race or ethnicity. That seemed like at least a possibility, or maybe even a trap. But it risks becoming essentialist in a weird way. How did you deal with that possibility of it as too pointed a metaphor, or were you aiming for something else?
Yeah, I think that was one of the, like, the thing, and I'm not, I think that there are plenty of animal books where one kind of animal becomes representative of a whole religion or race or ethnicity. Like it's one-to-one, and it's like all the mice are this group of human beings, And I was,
you had made some distinction between the use of animals and Animal Farm before.
Yes, right? I feel Animal Farm is a very I think that it's gotten, it's there and it's so good in certain ways, but like he doesn't use the animals enough. Like he doesn't think of them as animals. They are Stalin and like, or the proletariat, or they kind of hold these static positions. And the way I tried to get out of it is I was like, all the animals that would live in a country, England, Peru, would be Peruvian, but it's like a huge mixture of animals who have their own interactions. And so I think there was like, so I think the animals, like the alpaca, like identifies with alpaca politics, but that is complicated and not static. And he would also maybe relate to guinea pigs as also an animal from the same like region. So they would have these differences or similarities because of their heritage that would be different than like, so I did think of like, I really just tried to think of like where animals came from in the world, rather than like this guy is. And I think there would also be like, to move away from, I think there are animals that would have probably more like consistent power, but and I tried to track that more towards like how colonialism really worked with like horses and dogs. And so I don't think any one animal, I think they would have their internal politics that would be, yeah, like they would have a lot in common with sheep, but they might also have some issues with sheep.
I think you do have identity politics in the book, and they're very complicated and organically created markers of identity that kind of come through a historical narrative that you have kind of built in your mind, and they come through the book, and they're complicated, and they're not so easy mapped on one-to-one vis-a-vis race or nationality. So it's, again, going back to all that background world building work that you do so excellently in the book. I wanted to get this question in. And if there anybody else who wants to ask a question, please put it in the chat. But so it is kind of have this revolutionary politics of a kind are embedded in the book. And in a prescient / honest move, without giving away spoilers, this is a novel that does not describe the real kind of moment of revolutionary action or moment of big sea change, the big moment of change, but it rather focuses on that extended time that's a prelude to this act of imagination or act of revolution, or the prelude between utopia or dystopia. It's that hinge moment. And that struck me as pretty powerful because we seem precisely right now in a pretty hinge moment. Could you talk about the novel as capturing that prelude to an act of imagination, that moment just before?
I think that, yeah, it's like, I think we're all experiencing this where you might have had conversations, political conversations, or kind of trying to think of your own political, social trajectory. And it feels like at certain points you may be kind of like by yourself. You may only talk about it with your partner or friends. And then it feels like, oh, wow, lots more people are having this conversation, and more and more and more. And I think if the study of revolutions, it's like, it's often not it's an unexpected thing, or this seemed small, or it's happened before, we've seen all that, but it's like, it's the cumulative small drops, and so much of that is happening in people's quiet thoughts. But it becomes like, at what point does it just need to change? And that seems really quick, but there's been this kind of like filling to overflow. And I feel like, when I think of, if we're talking economically, the conversations that were being had in the worlds that I was in, pre-2008, post-2008, then even more and more and more, it feels like slow and also quite fast, how things have changed. But I wanted to not just say, oh, it happens. Like, there's that, again, like the heroic is like, this is the moment and this is everything dramatic. Whereas I felt like it was more important for me to try to talk about the difficult to quantify change that comes, and then you're like, how did I get here? And the character, who I definitely relate to, has a strong feeling of like responsibility. You've got to pay your student loans, you've got to turn in your papers, you've got to go to your job, and then it's like, when does the crisis feel really real? Is, I think, and I think if we talk about climate change, it's like the slow moving. We hear all these things, they build up in our mind. At what point does it need to change? So I just wanted to talk about the buildup, because I felt like we've been in a buildup, and this summer it doesn't feel like a buildup anymore, so it's unneeded.
Well, I think the book captures that, all that quiet talk that you speak of, all that personal confusion, that you wonder if other people are thinking about it too, or even other people are talking about it, but it's kind of like this very slow apocalypse that's happening. And what can you do about it? Is there anything to do about it? Is there any? And then when you see the flagship of possibility, you can then all of a sudden your head turns and I guess that possibility does exist and arises. But all that quiet talk is I think the thing that you capture beautifully in Alfonso's movements through his failures and his fumblings and his thinking about, should I join, or am I a part? Do I feel guilty, or what? Or do I, or will I get away with this, or will I be punished? I think those are insightful an insight into that psychology that we've all been going through. It's 8. I can ask one more question, unless someone wants to jump in with a question from the chat. Your main character is Alfonso, the alpaca, who's a doctoral candidate in a place a lot like CUNY's grad center. And your portrayal of the academy seems central to the book, or at least central to Alfonso's character, and maybe central to maybe that idea of quiet talk. And so not only regarding failures, so-called within the academy, but also kind of a failure of the academy itself is an analysis, or is an argument of the book. Could you talk about the notion of the academy to you in this book?
I think that what I wanted to talk about was how the university I loved it. I loved being in university so much. I felt so like it was the space of possibility and thought, and the quiet talk could exist in universities. And they sort of, in my experience, it was like where I got the tools to have these thoughts. And yet where we're at now, it's like, there is on the one side, it's not on the one side. I think, a corporate mentality, the university as a place of like profit and control and professionalization, like overwhelmed. I think there's so many, good people who are living within this umbrella that it doesn't work anymore. It's not doing what it needs to be. But at the same time, it's like, could it be, the university was like maybe a place of refuge and a utopian space. But I think that maybe we can't have those little escapes. It's like you can no longer, I'm just going to move to Canada because that's good, the good country, and I'm tired of living in the United States. In a similar way, you can't just be like, the world is messed up, so I'll go to the university and think these thoughts and that will change it. So that it's like, it's not the university's fault, but it is the university's fault, or the university contributed into this crisis that we're in, because people were pressured and succumbed to kind of turning away from what we really need to work on, even though I think so many people within it are doing the work. I also think the sort of pyramid scheme, the admitting too many people, trying to, so many people have the qualifications to be great teachers, but the idea of getting those jobs is like less and less accessible. So I think like not failed academics, and how it puts that in your mind, how you've like, oh, I failed this system, when it's like all those people are the ones that I often like love and think are doing great work. So it's like my love and also heartbreak over the university, but they're still doing the work because they're like basically making these people who, or forming people's thoughts, and almost like rejecting or being rejected from the university makes such great, makes a lot of great and frustrated and tortured people.
Yeah. Well, it has this potential utopian space, but people have been either escaping from it or being failed, being deemed failures by it, and it's no longer what, or if it ever was, it's no longer that place that we want it to be of leadership, right? It seems to be a place of retreat. I think. Did you want to say something else, Jim?
No.
We've, I think we've run out of time, but we've just touched on some of the issues in this novel. It's an incredibly complex and rich novel about New York City, about talking animals, and about the quiet talk before a moment of political revolution. You should buy it. There's a link that Maris has put in the chat, and thanks so much to Joni Murphy for this incredible work, and congratulations to her, and thank you all for coming. Maris, did you have something to say?
I was just going to say thank you, Eugene. And thank you for doing my job for me and telling everyone to buy the book. Please buy the book. Congratulations, Joni.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting.